at Pack 9963 of the Boy Scouts of America at the Hillside Islamic Center. This video is about general knife safety and usage as part of the Bear Claws lesson. It is bear specific, but really anyone can use this video to their advantage to learn about general knife usage and safety. Having said that, there is a concern that some parents have expressed that they are not comfortable with their scouts having possession of such a tool in their hands. We can definitely understand that point of view, and as our nation is going through certain issues, that is definitely a concern that needs to be addressed. Again, this is a tool, and we train our cubs to use it appropriately in the appropriate times and fashion that it's intended to be used for. I can tell you as a parent, yes, even I have expressed this to my son. Obviously they cannot take this to school. So when I'm teaching a lesson, what I do is I start off by giving the cubs a very serious lesson in consequences of treating this as a toy. So I will take the cubs and I will address them directly, and I will not sugarcoat the word. So I say, guys, listen to me. This is a tool. As well as a tool, this is also a trust. If I can't trust you with this, then later on when we are using, throwing axes or doing bow and arrow or using the rifles or the BB guns, if I can't trust you with this, then I definitely cannot trust you with those, and it'll become a huge issue. And regardless, if you ever treat this like a toy and take it to school by accident just to show to your friends, hey, look, I got a little knife in my hands, I want to show it to you, it's really fun and cool. Your teachers have been trained to recognize that as a threat, and it is a threat. They will assume automatically that you're there to either hurt someone or even kill someone, and they will immediately, and most schools, to my knowledge, are required to immediately contact law enforcement. Law enforcement will have a very aggressive response, and this can the best thing that can happen is getting expelled from the school, to put it lightly. So again, this is not a toy. People take it very seriously. If they see it, if they see that you're in possession of it, especially on school property, you will be determined to be a threat. And I'm sure that nobody here wants to give that impression. So, it is a very, very serious matter. It's not a toy. And if we feel that you have violated that trust, then obviously there will be other consequences to those actions that have to be taken care of. What we have determined as a policy at Hillside Islamic Center for Pack 9963, which is if you feel truly uncomfortable having this at home with your scout, we will safeguard it at the location, at the site, and hand those out to the cubs when it's necessary. And this is ultimately the parent's responsibility. If you feel that your child is okay having this at home and to be able to use it at home without your supervision, that's again your decision. For myself personally, I actually keep this in my possession, even though, as I've shown you, I have these things in my kitchen drawer at any given point that my kids use to help out in cooking. So, but I understand the concern, so I do keep this with me, and I do give it to my son when it's at the appropriate time for him to start carving for his projects at home. So I do supervise it to that level. Okay, let's start with our knife safety. Before we can even start using this knife, it's very important that the cubs be spread out and not on top of each other. So the proper amount of distance that you need to operate this safely is to be arm's length distanced away. So if you spread your arms out in both sides, no one should be closer than that distance, because the knife will eventually, when you're cutting something, the knife will eventually get stuck on something, and it's going to want to yank out of your hand and strike someone else. So if someone else is a proper distance away, they can't get hurt by this jerk reaction of your hand. So that's very important. That's the very first thing, that we are a proper distance away from each other when we're using this this tool. The second thing is obviously it goes without saying that there's absolutely no running when you're using something like this. There's no like pretend sword fighting, and of course, at no given point should you have a knife in an open position in your pocket traveling around with it. That's definitely a big no. It will cause harm. Generally, if there is a fixed blade, because this is a folding knife, obviously for obvious reasons, which is it folds. People call it different things, but if you had a fixed blade, for example, like this, generally when carrying a fixed blade, there's a sheath or some kind of carrier that this goes into for safety, in order for you to travel with it on your person, when hunting or fishing or anything like that. So when you're starting out, what you want to do is the very first thing is obviously once you have proper distance, you want to open this up, and when you open it up, you will hear that click. That click is the locking mechanism designed so this knife doesn't accidentally shut on your fingers. It's very important that that knife is fully engaged in the open position, and the locking mechanism, which can be seen here, is engaged. If it's not engaged, you will notice that there's a small gap over here where the knife fully extends, that it's not engaged, and you can see the locking mechanism slightly up, which indicating that it's not in the lock position. I have accidentally in the past used a knife like this. I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't fully locked, and it accidentally can close on your fingers when using it. So of course you want to make sure that it's fully open and locked in the locking position. This like I said, this Boy Scouts knife, it does have it's a very nice lock on it. It's very tight. I don't like those Walmart brand knives because they do tend to have like a cheaper design, and they tend to close on accident. So I'm not a fan of those. But it's up to you to decide which knife you want to use. I highly recommend this one from the Boy Scouts. So once it is in the locking position, if you notice the way I'm holding this knife, at no point do I actually hold the blade end of it. I don't hold the knife like this. I don't hold it like this. So if you notice, I'm always holding the knife either by the handle, or if I'm holding the blade part, I'm holding it from the dull part. That's very important to notice, that you can't handle it in this fashion or like this. Never like this or like this. Now you'll be surprised when we're using knives, especially in our scouts, with our scouts. Some of them tend to, when not experienced, they tend to hold it like this when they're first starting out, especially when they're trying to close the knife. They tend to grab it like this, and you have to watch out for that. Make sure that they're not doing that. When they're not experienced, a lot of people, when they're closing it, they tend to make that mistake. So open. Now let's practice closing it. In order to close this knife, there is a mechanism involved back here. It's a trigger in order to release the locking mechanism so the knife doesn't accidentally close on you with force. So if you were using it on something, it doesn't close by accident on your knuckles. In my experience, by the way, this is the part that the scouts really struggle with. When they're trying to depress this trigger right here, they find this is the hardest part for them because it is really tight. So you really need a very strong, firm grip action on that. A lot of times what the scouts will do as they're trying to push this, they'll be either pushing in the wrong place, or they're going to start squeezing it, and at the same time they'll start forcing this down in that direction, as if in order to close it. Now imagine if this had failed and you're forcing this down, and you're gonna immediately shut those on your fingers. So you never want to force this at any given point. Again, you want to just I'm just holding it right there, pressing it down depressly, and then like that. Very easy. Holding the blade like this in order for me to close it, or like you can close it like this as well. I prefer to have more control over it, so that's why I'm not forcing it. I hold the blade again like this, not the sharp end, just a tiny little grip. Press it down the button, not forcing this hand. I'm not forcing this hand, just holding it. all I'm using is pressing pressure over here, down. You see the locking mechanism go up and close like that. Very easy. Okay, so have your scouts have the practice that opening and closing. That's very important. Like I said, most of the time, if the scout is making a mistake, it's going to be during that locking period where they're doing that. The other safety feature is how to hand over a knife to somebody else. For example, if I ask the scout to hand me the knife, a lot of times they make the mistake and they want to hand it to me in my right hand, which is I'm across from them, and they'll hold the blade again. Again, this is a dangerous thing because if somebody else was to yank that blade, you could see it'll obviously cut the hands. So so the proper way to hand someone a knife, if you're holding it, to hand someone a knife is to first, the sharp end of the blade is away from me. The tip is not in my palm, it's facing outward. If you can see, it's facing out in this direction. It's to hand it this way, and I'm holding the actual, not the blade, but the handle part of it. And that's the proper way to hand someone the blade. It would be better if I was handing it someone who's right-handed to hand them from my left hand, so they're taking it directly to their right hand. But it's okay either way; it doesn't matter. So you can safely hand someone the blade this way. Never should you hand the blade this way to anyone. That's very dangerous. And of course, you don't want to take it when you're taking a blade. You don't want to take a blade in this fashion. Obviously, you can cut your hands if there's some jerking motion. So open, close. To hand someone the blade, the best option is obviously to close the blade first and then hand it. But if it was a fixed blade, something you can't close, or if you want to just hand it off very quickly, you quickly just, you have the blade in your hand, always in your right hand. You just switch it up and give it, or in your left hand to someone who's right-handed, and you give it to them like this. Nice and easy, safe way to transfer a knife from one person to another, so that no one gets hurt. So again, never am I ever touching this sharp end of the blade ever at any given time, and I'm always keeping this pointed edge away from me and my hands at any given time. So even if there was an accident, I don't accidentally get stabbed or cut with this blade. So always holding the blade most often like this. So when actually holding the blade and now making cuts, like I said, this is a general utility knife. This is designed primarily to cut from this end of the blade. That's where most of your leverage is going to come from, and we'll explain that in a minute. You can also obviously use this end to kind of like dice things, but mostly when you are cutting with a blade like this, you're going to be using the butt end, or I'm forgetting the name of this part specifically, but this part of the knife mostly, that's going to do most of your cutting. That's why you can see over here there is extra meat or metal on this blade to reinforce the blade on this section. Now, if for example you had a chef knife, you'll notice that it actually does not have extra material over here at part of the blade, because the blade is intended to cut mostly on the front end of the knife. So in a slicing motion, so you can see that because of the weight distribution, it's designed to cut in this fashion, so the most force coming at this end. So that is why in a general life, you'll see that this extra part of the material is there to reinforce that, and that's important when making cuts, to understand what part of the blade you can get the most leverage out of. That's important when, like I said, making cuts. So let's begin our initial cuts. The book in our Bear Scouts manual recommends starting with the bar of soap. However, for our demonstrations, I will demonstrate to you using a piece of wood how to make a general cut. When you are cutting, the proper way to hold this knife is, it should fit in your hands in this fashion. I've seen some kids use it like this, almost like a pen. This is wrong. You want to use it like this. That's what it's intended for, designed for. It fits the most comfortably in your hand when you're using it in this fashion. If you've noticed that there are some grooves over here. They're designed for your thumb to sit on top of to gain the most leverage when cutting something, so that's something more difficult to cut. So, for example, if you're not going to hold the knife like this and cut like this, the knife is literally slipping in my hand. So you want to gain some leverage on it. So you apply the thumb in that groove section, and then you start making your cuts. Now, when making cuts, it's important for me to not dig in all the way in and cut really, really deep. That's not what the knife is intended for. You really want to make shallow cuts. So even though this is a hard piece of wood, you can see that I am able to chip away at it, start cutting away at it. You see these little wood chips that are forming. That's really the way the knife is intended to use. It's obviously not a saw to cut this hard piece of wood. So when we're using it to cut the soap, the proper way to cut it is you want to get leverage on it, and you want to start cutting. Another very important thing, and this is where a lot of kids will get their cuts, you always want to cut away from yourself. As you become a knife expert, obviously that will change. You will see that some people who are very proficient at cooking, you'll see them peeling this way. We're not going to do that here because that takes a little bit of skill to know when the knife is about to slip or not, and in order to catch it the proper way in your hands. We're definitely not going to do that here. What we're going to do is we're going to practice cutting away from ourselves at any given time. So if I was to shape this into an object, which is part of the first lesson, you want to shape this into something. The book recommends either cutting out a bear or a wolf or a leaf, something simple. The way to go about that is to hold this firmly in your hand and to start cutting. Now, some of the cubs, they make a mistake. Even though they're cutting away from the hands, they'll have their fingers in the proximity of the blade. And that's very dangerous. This is where they get cuts because they don't realize their finger is not far away enough as they're cutting. Like, let's, for example, up here, and their fingers are down here. They don't realize that blade can slip and cut their hand. So that's very important. You have to make sure that their fingers at all given points are far away enough from the blade so that if it does slip, it won't slice their hand open. So when does a blade actually slip? That's an important part to realize, and that's kind of gained from using the knife. That's the idea of this lesson, for you to get more comfortable using a knife. If you see here, this is the easiest thing to point out. In all sorts of wood, there'll be knots, and these are like the denser areas of the wood. This is where, like, generally what the branches are coming out from. These are denser areas. It's very easy to get a knife stuck somewhere in this area because it's a denser part of the wood. The scout or someone who's inexperienced is going to want to put a lot of pressure on that. They're going to want to put a lot of pressure on that, and they're going to try to force it. And at that point, the knife is going to slip from that momentum. So again, what you want to do is always have your hands away. If you do come to a point where the knife is stuck, it's best to just start over again and to not continue all the way through. So in order for the knife to slip. So, so let's make our cuts. As we're cutting, I'm cutting nice shallow cuts. I'm not digging deep into it. I'm just cutting nice shallow cuts away from me. And you can see there is, if you just saw that, there was a slipping motion and it almost grazed my finger. But because my finger was an adequate length away, it just missed it. If I had it been any closer, it would have cut my hand. And that's to be expected. So again, it's nice shallow cuts. As we come to the end, you can see it does slip. Now that I've gotten experience cutting with this particular piece of soap, I realize, well, at the end, it is going to slip a little. So I kind of let off the pressure a little bit, and I just go a little bit slower at the end. That's the proper way to cut it. And then some scouts, they kind of forget you can change the direction of the soap, and if they want to go in this direction, they're going to start cutting towards themselves, or they're going to start cutting in weird angles. You never want to do that. You always want to have a comfortable angle to cut with. You can always just easily, if you want to go in the other direction, just switch the soap around and start just going in the other direction very, very easily. So they sometimes forget that, and they just sometimes they try to go in weird. You'll see them do it. It's some weird angles. Make sure they're not doing that. Make sure that they're always using this proper cutting method, which is again leveraged in their hand tightly away from themselves. So, having said that, let's start talking about stop cuts. Stop cut is very useful. It's if you wanted to maybe cut a precise cut and you wanted not to go any knife to slip any further, you will make a stop cut. So in something soft like this, like a bar of soap, it's very easy. Again, you want to get a nice comfortable grip on your knife, and you just want to press down and make like a V, a little notched V. I don't know if you can see that, there's a little notched V in that, and that'll be a nice stop cut. If you see, if I go like this, if I start cutting, it will stop at my stop cut, and nice and clean cut right there. That is not the same for a harder piece of material like a piece of wood. You can't just cut down on it. The way you would do that in this type of material is you're gonna press down, not very, very hard, but you're gonna press down firmly, and you're gonna just wiggle it a little bit, just like this. Wiggle it, just like this. Again, I'm not forcing it. I'm just wiggling it slightly to make an indentation. And then I'm going to make a tiny, tiny V, a little bit distance, tiny little cut towards it. And I'm going to scoop out. So I don't know if you saw that. That's a little indentation. Again, I'm going to wiggle it around. Then do like a scooping motion almost, like this, because I do want there to be a nice, clean stop cut. So just a little scooping it out. Again, like this. So if you can see that, there's a nice little groove there. That's for my stop cut. So when I come in and I want to stop at that cut, so my knife is getting stuck, I'm going to restart it. Knife is getting stuck again, restart it. Knife is getting stuck, restart. So this cut is obviously too deep and stops right there. So that's my nice stop cut, and that's the intended like that. As you can see, it stops right there. That's a stop cut. Very, very useful when you're trying to make more precision cuts. A stop cut. Now, the final thing that I like to make my cubs try, which is cutting something a little bit different. Most of the time when I'm in the field, camping, hiking, hunting, whatever, fishing, I'm using my general utility knife to cut mostly wire of some kind or some kind of rope. And the best way to do that is, for especially a rope like this, is to make a little loop in your hand, hold it tightly, just a nice simple loop. You can go like this, doesn't matter, a nice simple loop. And what you want to do is you want to cut this. Now the proper way to do something like this, and it's important for the scouts to feel this, that not all the materials are the same. And something like this, which is more flexible, it's not that easy to cut. It is very easy to slip the knife on something like this if you're not cutting it properly. So what most of the scouts do is they'll just try to force it, like almost straight force it through, which is not going to work. What you want to do, and others, what they do is they don't just put enough pressure. They'll just like wiggle it around. Nothing's going to happen. So the proper way to do that is, again, I'm leveraging the knife. I'm tilting the knife in that direction so this doesn't slip at any given time. If you were cutting it like this, it will slip. So I'm tilting the knife a little bit forward, and I'm just putting a little bit of pressure, and I'm just moving it back and forth. Very easy. If you saw, maybe within 3 motions, I was able to cut through. Most of the time, a lot of scouts, they struggle with that. They're going to just keep going like this, or they're going to put too much pressure and just not going to go through because they don't have the proper angle on it and the proper leverage. Again, one more time. Brand new rope, put it through, and I'm going to start now. So I'm just showing you that I put enough pressure, and 1, 2, 3, done. Nice and easy cut. So I like to do that to have my scouts practice. Done using knife closed. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've learned something. If you have any comments, please reach out to me. If I've made a mistake, I'll be happy to fix it. So happy scouting.